Good morning, everybody. We are approaching the 10th anniversary of a really historic vote. A vote, of course, where all the political parties and nearly all of the establishment were lined up very firmly behind Remain, but the people of this country voted by quite a big margin to leave. Yet here we are, a decade on. And let's think about the reasons why people voted to leave. Well, one of them that was absolutely key was to get us out of the regulatory rulebook of the European Union. A rulebook over which Parliament had no powers of veto whatsoever. And whilst we did, in the Council of Ministers, regularly fight new European regulations and laws, in over 90% of cases, we were outvoted. So we voted to take back control and to put Parliament back in charge. And nobody ever pretended that Parliament would be perfect, but at least we could get rid of them every 4 or 5 years and replace them with somebody else with a different manifesto. In terms of the business community, overwhelmingly, small and medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurial businesses supported leave, whereas the big corporates, the big global companies generally supported, in fact wholly, to be honest, supported Remain. But being out of the single market was seen as a massive opportunity, certainly by the 5.7 million people in Britain who run their own businesses. And I was very hopeful that what we'd see was a lot more entrepreneurship, a lot more competition in the marketplace, and us breaking away from a European Union that had been the low-growth capital of the world for many, many years. And, by the way, it still is the low-growth capital of the world. And yet, we hear overnight, as a continuing part of Keir Starmer's so-called EU reset, that effectively he wants us to rejoin the single market and put us back into regulatory alignment, literally bypassing Parliament. Sadly, going back to single market rules is much easier than it should be, because the Conservatives did not deliver. And above all, Kemi Badenoch, when she was the minister in charge, had the opportunity to wipe away 5,000 EU regulations, but chose not to. I'm a conservative, she said, not an arsonist. So for Starmer to go back to single market rules, to accept everything that's new, is very much easier because Brexit was not properly delivered in the way that those who voted for it wanted. But the same applies on an even bigger scale to the vexed issue of immigration and the population explosion this country has been undergoing since the turn of the century. And there is no doubt that the Brexit vote, the increased turnout, was above all about getting back control of our borders, being more selective about those that came. The Australian-style point system was one that I pointed to, in that you could choose sectorally what shortages you had, what skill sets you needed. But it was also about radically reducing the numbers coming in to stop the population explosion. And I think after 4 manifesto commitments to reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year, I think we all genuinely thought that Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, might do something about it. The truth is, he did the opposite with the Boris wave. Now, I think the arguments about the lack of integration in our cities, the arguments about the rapid, worrying growth of extreme Islamism are arguments that have been well rehearsed, and I think pretty much everybody accepts that's a problem. But for all these years, and I've been campaigning on the population growth since 2004, every time we've had this debate, I've been told, Nigel, don't worry your little head, because it's good for the economy. It's good for GDP, it's good for growth, it's good for the economy. And there's not really been a proper debate about the economic damage of not just low-skilled immigration into Britain, but actually, as Zia will show us in a moment's time, vast numbers of people coming into Britain who do not work and probably never, ever will work. This has come at a potentially massive future cost. Now, there is still time. There is still something we can do about this Boris wave. But if over a couple of million people get indefinite leave to remain over the course of the next 18 months, we will be putting around our necks an economic millstone that, frankly, will be catastrophic. As I say, both of the big arguments of the day lead back to that Brexit vote of 10 years ago and point directly to a political class who never believed in it and never, frankly, wanted to implement it. And it has been quite remarkable over the course of the last 48 hours that we have a Conservative leader complaining about this, despite the fact she didn't get rid of all those EU regulations, claiming victory over the Chagos deal when it was that Conservative government that entered into 11 rounds of negotiations and opened the door. And even now, the Conservatives sounding strong on defence, when, of course, it's they that have hollowed out our defences, in particular the Royal Navy, to the current shameful level that we see. Of course, there are some that will say, but you've got Suella Braverman. You've got Robert Jenrick in your party. Yes, absolutely. And if you read what Suella has written on this, and you read what Robert has written on this, they tried from within to stop the disaster that really started properly in 2021, and that's why they resigned or were fired. I will hand over to Zia Yusuf now, who will speak to stop the Boris wave, because it can, to a large extent, still be stopped, and if we do it, it'll save every household in Britain over the coming decades up to £20,000 a year. Thank you, Zia.
Good morning, everyone. So today we publish a report called The Cost of the Boris Wave. It's a detailed analysis of the fiscal impact of the Boris Wave, and it reveals it is set to cost every household in Britain £20,000. The Boris Wave of unprecedented mass immigration permanently altered the culture of this country. It's permanently altered the fiscal trajectory of the country. It permanently altered the lives of British people against their wishes. The Tory party, having promised in 4 consecutive manifestos to cut immigration significantly, instead unleashed the most extraordinary surge in mass immigration this country has ever seen. Having presided over the Brexit vote and promised to take back control, they threw open our borders. Between January of 2021 and June 2024, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Conservative successors issued a staggering 3.8 million long-term visas, resulting in gross immigration of 4.8 million and net immigration of 2.6 million. Annual net immigration averaged more than double the previous decade, which was already a period of historically high mass immigration. But these mind-boggling numbers do not tell the full story of the catastrophe. It was not just the size, but the composition of the Boris wave that was fundamentally different to previous cohorts of migrants. Economically, just 17%, of the Boris wave migrants came to Britain as workers on work visas. Culturally, Britain went from immigration primarily from EU countries to vastly higher levels of immigration from primarily non-EU countries. Parts of the country changed beyond recognition in just a few years. And while Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister, his poisonous legacy is only just beginning to unfold. In fact, the Boris wave is a ticking fiscal bomb about to explode. According to the government's own figures, between 1.6 and 2.2 million Boris wave migrants are now becoming eligible to receive indefinite leave to remain and, shortly after, British citizenship. As the report demonstrates, the cost of the Boris wave gaining ILR and then citizenship in Britain will be £622 billion in real terms. That's 3 times the annual budget for the NHS, 10 times our annual defence budget. So our message is firstly to the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Do not U-turn on your ILR reforms. Your Home Secretary, to her credit, is aware of this fiscal time bomb about to explode on the British people. That's why she announced retrospective changes to indefinite leave to remain to delay such grants to Boris wave migrants. Such a delay would give a future Reform government a chance to deal with this properly. But now, as we know, as has been widely reported, including by many in this room, Starmer is no longer really running his party nor the country. And Shabana Mahmood is isolated, outmanoeuvred and outgunned by the Labour Parliamentary Party. In fact, I hear she's preparing to resign. Here's what we know for certain. If Starmer U-turns on the retrospective ILR reforms, by the time 2029 comes, over half the Boris wave migrants will already be citizens. Over half the £600 billion cost will already be baked in. Of all the Starmer U-turns, this would be the most historic and consequential. Our second message is that a Reform government, led by Nigel, will deal with this issue decisively. We will abolish indefinite leave to remain, replacing it with a 5-year renewable work visa with a special visa available to spouses of UK citizens. The work visa will have a much higher salary threshold so that all recipients are net contributors to the economy, and a much higher standard of English will be required. There will also be an acute special skills visa available to those working in national critical sectors like care. We will immediately terminate welfare payments to all foreign nationals in Britain, saving £9 billion a year in universal credit payments alone. And thirdly, we recognise the historic scale and severity of this financial catastrophe. The Boris wave. It caused Britain enormous damage, and the fact it was done against the wishes of the British people. It is without a doubt one of the biggest political scandals of our lifetimes. It culturally transformed our country and has the potential to bankrupt it. So, a Reform government will commission a national inquiry into the Boris wave, how it happened, who authorised each aspect of it, and why. The likes of Boris Johnson and Priti Patel will be compelled to testify under oath, along with anyone else involved. The goal of this inquiry will be to get to the truth and also to ensure it never happens again. Look, the true cost of the Boris wave to all areas of life for British people may well be incalculable. But there are parts we can calculate. And the numbers are so enormous that they have the potential to bankrupt the country we love. That's why reform will do what is necessary to avert this fiscal disaster, to repair the damage and heal the open wounds the Tories and Labour left on this country. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Zia. Right, let's open up to questions, beginning with Nick Eardley from the BBC.
Thank you. Morning. Nigel Farage, you touched on this at the start, but the government wants to give itself the power to align closer with EU single market rules. It says that that will grow the economy and bring down costs. Do you accept that argument? Is it a price worth paying? And a second, if I may, you'll have seen the extensive reporting from the Sunday Times over the weekend about Richard Tice and allegations his company didn't pay tax properly on dividend payments. Are you certain he eventually paid the right tax? And you want to be Prime Minister. Is that something that would be acceptable, these sorts of errors, in a reform government?
Well, I'm not a tax lawyer any more than you are, or anybody else in this room. But even the so-called expert, Labour activist Dan Needle, which he is a Labour activist, but he's the one that's quoted and used all the time when these disputes come to light. Have a look at the messaging that he was putting out yesterday, where he made it very, very clear, no attempt at avoidance or evasion overall because of dividends taken personally and a higher rate of tax paid. If anything, Mr. Tice might have slightly overpaid tax. So has the Exchequer lost in any way at all? No. I have looked at our REITs, REITs, and they are a very, very tax-efficient form of investment. I know a little bit about them, but let me assure you, this is an incredibly complex area of tax law set up basically to help the commercial property market. I mean, that's why this was done in the first place. But as I say, overall, the Exchequer has not lost out. It may possibly have actually got more tax than had the company itself just paid corporation tax. In fact, I'm certain that's true. Will rejoining the single market grow the economy? Well, it didn't whilst we were in it, and we are rejoining the low growth capital of the world. We are rejoining economies, many of whom are doing even worse than we are right at this moment in time. It's a very fast-moving world in lots and lots of ways. The British economy needs to be flexible, needs to be adaptable, but equally needs to recognise that Europe is a declining part of the global economy, and actually quite rapidly declining. And to tie ourselves ever closer to it makes no sense in economic terms. And in democratic terms, it is a total betrayal of the Brexit vote of 10 years ago. And it is also a complete breach of the Labour manifesto and a further devaluation of Parliament. And as Prime Minister, he's devalued Parliament already. He won't even answer a question at PMQs. He just reads off a script that someone's prepared for him. An answer's nothing to do with the question at all. And fewer people are tuning into the Parliament channel. Fewer and fewer people are interested in what happens in Parliament, and that's sad in a democracy. And all this will do, frankly, if we do this, anybody in business will say to themselves, what is the point of even voting if it isn't the people I vote for that have any say over this legislation? So I think it's absolutely dreadful. Keith Bayes, GB News.
Nigel Farage, your executive summary bases its figures on the 21-25 period, but Suella Braverman was Home Secretary in 2022 and 2023.
Yes.
Immigration exceeded 1.2 million, and net migration reached a record high. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick at the time also spoke about procuring more hotels for migrants. Given their record in office, shouldn't they also face scrutiny as part of any national inquiry?
Yes.
And have you also worked out how much their actions have cost the British taxpayer as a result of decisions they took whilst in post? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, Robert Jenrick was tasked with housing people who were crossing the Channel. But whether you source hotels or HMOs, he was told you've got to put them somewhere. He resigned. Robert Jenrick resigned as immigration minister because he was appalled at what was going on. And Suella Braverman's very interesting. And she's already publicly said she'd love to take part in this inquiry. She said, when she took the position, 1 million people a year were coming. She said the first thing she did manage to do was to stop students bringing dependents, something which, by the way, the leader of the opposition strongly campaigned for, and it's available publicly. She even said so in Parliament. But Suella says she had constant fights with the Prime Minister, with the Chancellor, with senior figures in the government, constant fights to get change. And she admits she failed to get change, and that's why she went. Very, very simple. And they both say, hands up. We tried, we failed. We couldn't turn it around. The Conservative government seemed to be obsessed with the idea that mass migration was good for the economy. But as these figures and these workings very clearly show, actually the opposite was true. Compare and contrast those two and what they say to Priti Patel and others who, when they're asked, would they apologise for what they did, point blank refused to do so. And Kemi Badenoch, who seems now to disassociate herself with virtually everything she did and supported whilst being in government. Never trust the Tories. That's frankly what I would say. Never trust the Tories. What they say at elections and what they do are completely different things. Faye Brown from Sky News. Sorry, Sarah, I'm hogging this.
Hi, Nigel. If I could just get your reaction to the events unfolded in the Middle East. Kemi Badenoch said this morning she declined to comment on whether she thought Donald Trump's blockade of the Iranian ports is a good idea. What is your honest thoughts, and do you think that the UK should be getting involved?
Well, I'm pleased we're at least sending minesweepers, but we can't get involved beyond that. I mean, look, this Prime Minister wouldn't make a decision anyway, but we can't get involved. We haven't got a navy. Even HMS Dragon, which took us 3 weeks and 1 day to get to Cyprus to protect a British sovereign base, is now back in dock with failure. Even if we wanted to help with a blockade, we do not have the means to do so. This is an utter humiliation for our country. Should be the biggest wake-up call we frankly ever had in the entire history of the country on defence. As for the blockade itself, well, history shows they can work, they can be successful. We certainly operated a very effective blockade in sort of throughout 1917 and 1918, and it worked. But this does not come without risk. And it brings us back to, I'm guessing what Trump's trying to do is to get China to start pressuring the Iranians. I think that's the game of chess that we're seeing here. I understand it, but I don't know where this war ends any more than you do. If they have stopped Iran having a nuclear weapon, well, that's good. But it does begin to feel that the exit strategy might not have been as clearly thought through as one would wish. But I don't know. I've not had conversations with the President. The British Prime Minister, I assume, has, although their relations are pretty much at all-time lows. Amelie Jen from Channel 4 News.
Thank you very much, Amelia Jen from Channel 4 News. You said that Richard Tice has paid the taxpayer back. Why do you not know the exact figure? And should he, and would you support him saying so on the record?
Do give me a lecture on REITs and how they work, would you? I mean, while we're here, give us the benefit of your knowledge on this. I'd be thrilled.
Well, I'm not a tax expert.
No, and nor am I. Thank you.
But surely you've asked him whether or not he has paid back and how much
if our
he
biggest
has paid
critic,
back.
If our biggest critic is Labour activist Dan Needle, and he is a tax expert, right? I mean, he is. He's good at it. If our biggest critic says that Richard Tice has not evaded or avoided tax, has paid the full amount, and actually maybe even a little bit more the full amount, then I'm satisfied with that. But if you can give me a lecture on REITs and how they work, then I'd be delighted. It's an incredibly complex piece of tax law. As I repeat, if our worst critic says there's nothing to see here, I'm pleased. And by the way, the Labour Party's property company, which is quite big, with substantial sums of money, has paid no corporation tax for 25 years. That's well worth having a look at. I'll be keen to see what Dan Needle has to say about that one. Martina Bett from The Sun.
Thank you very much, Martina Bett from The Sun. You're, of course, promising sweeping changes to migration and benefits, but if people from that 2021-2024 Boris wave have already come here, gained citizenship by the time you're in office, are you accepting that there's nothing you can do retrospectively beyond potentially spending millions of taxpayers' money on this public inquiry?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Look, the reason why, the first thing I said in terms of our message today is to the current government to not U-turn on what Shabana Mahmood has already announced in terms of retrospective ILR reforms. I mean, for a Labour Home Secretary to be announcing that wouldn't be happening unless the Treasury were in her ear and the Prime Minister's ear.
Well, unless you'd led the way on the whole ILR debate. It was Zia that led the way with this months ago to say ILR is a big problem coming down the track, and to quote you, to Shabana Mahmood's credit, she obviously looked at that and ran the numbers and decided at least to kick it onto the long grass by pushing it on for a further 5 years. The point about ILR is as soon as you get it, you have automatic rights to full benefits and to bring dependents into this country. So actually, whatever the calculations in here, if things stay as they are, it could be far worse than that. Yeah. If those that get ILR are able to bring lots of dependents who are not contributors to the economy. So look, we are, and on the citizenship point, and if we get to citizenship, well, let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, look, we're not going to rule anything out, but the reason why we're saying what we're saying today is because we hope it won't come to that, and we think Labour must not U-turn on those retrospective ILR reforms because they will be baking in a fiscal catastrophe that they recognise is about to happen.
They do. Thank you. Aaron Newbury, Daily Express.
Good morning. Yesterday, the Daily Express was told that those involved in the Boris wave, the reform would consider sort of criminal conduct claims against them. Does that extend to everybody involved in the Boris wave, including Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick, under whom net migration hit 906,000 per year?
Well, I'd love to know, was this just sheer incompetence, or was it done willfully? Because I remember the day they lowered the limits in 2021 at which people could come to Britain. And I remember myself on the day saying, well, surely this means more will come. Was it negligence? Was it willful? Zia?
Yeah, well, that's the point of an inquiry, and we don't want to make too many presumptions about that. If your question is, will anyone be if they are relevant witnesses to the inquiry, they will be compelled to come and give statements under oath. And we're very clear about that. As Suella has already tweeted this morning, there's no one in the country who would like this inquiry to happen more than her. And look, I'll say this too, because in a potential reform government, I would be the Home Secretary. So, look, the reality is, if the Prime Minister of the country doesn't want to secure our borders, is quite happy with insane levels of mass immigration, there is very, very little a Home Secretary can actually do, which is why on the lectern I said I was imploring Keir Starmer not to U-turn. The Prime Minister has enormous power. Number 10 Downing Street has enormous power in terms of immigration policy. And that is why, frankly, as much as a patriot, I hope this doesn't happen, it does seem increasingly likely that Mahmood is going to get overruled. Starmer will cave. He's clearly not running his party nor the country anymore. He's going to cave to the left-wing parliamentary party and whatever it is Angela Rayner is cooking up. So I hope he doesn't U-turn on this, but I can't emphasise enough. If he does, he is baking in a fiscal catastrophe worth manifold times our NHS and defence budgets combined.
Amy Gibbons, Daily Telegraph.
Thanks both. Nigel, the Tories have claimed an inquiry into the Boris wave would cost millions. So can I ask if you think that would be money well spent? And also, sorry, just quickly for Zia as well, what makes you say that Shabana Mahmood is preparing to resign? And if she did, is there a world in which you would welcome her to reform?
If an inquiry costing millions saved us 622 billion, I would call that quite a good return on our money.
Yeah, I think it's the quantum of numbers. I mean, one thing I will say, just more generally, is that if you actually look at how much any of these inquiries have cost historically, it's astronomical and it's insane. And there's a cartel of lawyers that basically gorge themselves on taxpayer money, whether it's HS2, whether it's inquiries. So all of the costs of all of those things will come down. But as Nigel says, the the quantum here. We must ensure that for future generations this cannot happen again. In terms of why I say, look, I'm not going to reveal my sources, but I'm...
What does Polymarket say?
Yeah, well, I haven't looked at that. I don't know if there's Polymarket on it. But look, again, I mean this sincerely as a patriot. Both me and Nigel sincerely hope Starmer will not U-turn, and that's why I gave Shabana Mahmood credit for the fact that she recognises the things that we've been saying.
Yeah. Daisy Eastlake, The Times.
Thank you. How many of the people who came to Britain during Johnson's premiership and since would you aim to deport if you were to put even a broad number on it? Half, three-quarters, all of them? And in what time frame? And if I may, how would you practically deliver this scale of removal? Have you modelled a cost for that and how you would pay for it? Thank you.
Well, we did actually launch many months ago Operation Restoring Justice, and perhaps we ought to repeat the exercise. There were estimates, calculations working there, and we are talking about several 100,000 people. I mean, that is the quantum that we're talking about. But I think maybe a sort of reboot of Operation Restoring Justice here.
Yeah, and look, with regards to the Boris wave, obviously the numbers are enormous. We're talking about north of 4 million people gross who came in that time. And, I want to emphasise it, only 17% of those people came in on work visas. And so, look, what we're saying is we will have a renewable work visa that people need to move on to, and to the degree people did not qualify for those visas because they were not economically contributing, or, for example, did not have the requisite standard of English and therefore were not integrated properly, then yes, those people will be ineligible for those visas. So if you look at precedent around the world, there is a good precedent, actually, that many people just accept that and decide to leave of their own volition. But we're going to have to prioritise. Look, the state of this country as a result of mass immigration over the last 2 decades is such that we have to prioritise. So we're going to start. We're going to make no apologies. Our deportation programme will start with, for example, our foreign criminals. There's north of 10,000 of them languishing in our jails.
And then those that came illegally.
Yeah.
So there is an order of that. And Daisy, if you got a job working as a US correspondent for the Times, if that work permit ran out, you get a knock at the door, be put in handcuffs and taken to the airport. And this is actually what happens in most... This is the odd thing about this debate. You would think that what Zia and I are saying is, wow, this is so way out there. I mean, what country does that? Well, about 190 in the world. So all we've ever asked for with this topic is for us just to be a normal country. Claire Ellicott, Daily Mail.
Thank you. You've said you'll fight Keir Starmer's Brexit plans every step of the way. What does that mean? What will you do? And would you work with the Tories to try to defeat them? And also, can I ask your thoughts on Donald Trump's tirade against the Pope? Thank you.
I haven't seen that, but I mean, no tirade he puts out would surprise me. But I have not seen this particular one, I have to say. Well, we're fighting Labour now very, very hard. I mean, be in no doubt that in the northeast of England, in the northwest of England, in parts of the Midlands and in South Wales, we are the main challengers to Labour. They also have other problems from the Green vote happening in parts of central Birmingham, happening in parts of the East End of London. So the government as a whole is in very, very serious trouble. So, our campaign, and by the way, these areas in the north that I'm talking about, these areas in South Wales, these are big Brexit voting areas. Historically, Labour, since World War I, well, in fact, in the case of South Wales, back to the 1890s, but these are big Brexit voting areas, and, I will be discussing this over the course of the next 3 weeks as I continue. This is now week 6 of touring the country and very rarely coming to London. And working with the Tories on what? Brexit. But I mean, they were against it. They were against it. They fought tooth and nail against it. They then gave us a Prime Minister who tried to betray it. They then finally gave us a Prime Minister who said he was in favour of it. And because he promised there'd be no regulatory alignment, I stood aside in hundreds of seats in the general election, only then to let us down on everything else. So working with them on anything is very difficult because it's tough to know what they actually genuinely believe. Thank you. Samara Gill, Talk.
Thank you. This one's for Zia. So just to be clear, you said that you'd still haul in Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman for questioning. So if they are found guilty, what will happen next?
Well, look, the nature of an inquiry is not that. You've probably been watching a few too many Batman movies. The inquiry is designed to try to understand what happened.
The truth.
Yes, get to the bottom of the truth. And so, whatever my or Nigel's personal presumptions might be about what happened, I think it is really important for the country to move on from this. To prevent what's currently happening, but to prevent such a thing happening again, such a massive betrayal. Yeah. It is important that nobody should be immune from being brought before that inquiry and forced to testify under oath. And again, I'll reiterate, both Robert and Suella, they would absolutely love for this to happen, because again, the number of meetings that would have happened before, the minutes from those meetings that were had in those rooms behind closed doors, I think it's really important. It will be a cathartic process for the country to go through, and I'm very confident actually that what you'll see is that people like Suella and Robert will come out of that looking very good indeed.
And they've given their testimony already. They've explained very publicly why they resigned, why they were sacked, what went wrong, how hard they fought to get change, and how impossible it was to move high command of the Conservative Party. Aggie Chambray, LBC.
Thank you very much. Aggie Chambray, LBC. Just to follow up on Claire's question, I've got the quotes of what Donald Trump said about the Pope. He said He was weak on crime, terrible for foreign policy, that the Pope should get his act together, that he was weak on nuclear weapons, and also that he was not a big fan. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's acceptable to attack the Pope like that? And secondly, if you were in government and the SNP were to get a majority in next month's elections, would you allow them to have a referendum?
Well, the answer to that's no, because referendums are genuinely meant to be a generational issue. And everybody was promised in 2014 that it would be a once-in-a-generation referendum, and the result was perfectly clear. It was a result to remain part of the United Kingdom, and there's no reason to change that. I suspect one of the reasons the SNP are campaigning on this is to distract from what an absolute catastrophe Scottish education has been, Scottish health service provision has been, let alone the highest drugs deaths per capita of any comparable country on this side of the Atlantic. I see it all as a diversion tactic, and the answer is no. We are a clear, committed unionist party. If at a point in the future, when that generation has moved on, they want to have another look, then of course that would be reasonable. Just as we were told the Brexit referendum was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and right up until this day, there are those in Westminster seeking to betray that vote. On the Pope, you know what? I think that the Pope, the Church of England, any religious leader should be open to mockery, cartooning, criticism, and I think this debate, particularly if we effectively have this government bringing in new blasphemy laws, is one that's got a lot further to run. I don't agree or disagree with him. I don't know the Pope particularly. I mean, he's the leader of an enormous church, a church that has stayed truer to itself than the Church of England. And I'm not going to join criticism. I'm not going to condemn what Trump has said. I'm just not going to get involved. Lucy White, Bloomberg.
I just wanted to ask on the idea that this national inquiry is to figure out if the Conservatives were committing incompetence or willful incompetence. Sorry. Do you run the risk of sounding a little bit conspiracy theorist, given that most people at the time would have said that it was a knee-jerk response to the massive vacancies in the labour market post-Brexit and post-pandemic? And if I can ask as well, the care worker section in your booklet, you say that there's a heavy reliance on welfare among dependents of care workers. Can I ask what your evidence is for that, given that most people that I've spoken to who came here with a dependent have been supported by the dependent who's been working in an industry, for example, like hospitality?
Yeah, but not with that money.
And also, sorry, on that as well, can I ask on the fiscal impact? You've given some pretty bleak forecasts for the fiscal impact of care workers. Does that also factor in the cost of training British care workers and paying for them?
I'll do the first bit, shall I, on the big numbers. in a country that historically had net migration running at 30,000 a year for over half a century, which in the Blair years and the EU enlargement years went up to 200, 250,000, and for a party that says in 2010 we'll reduce to tens of thousands, does it again in 2015, does it again in 2017, tells us that because of Brexit we're going to be selective and bring numbers down. When you've promised it in 4 consecutive general elections, and net migration goes from an historic 30,000 to nearly 1 million, I think it's perfectly reasonable and fair to ask a question. Did they just lie to the British people at every single election, thinking that's what people want to hear, but we've no intention of carrying it out? And if that is the case, does that undermine our democracy? No. What we want to try and do is restore some faith in our democratic system. And if that means this party that's been around for a couple of 100 years needs to go away for a few decades and rethink itself, then that might be a good thing and not a bad thing.
Yeah, and look, the obvious response to, is it a knee-jerk response to labour shortages? I'd reiterate, 17%, 1/7 of the Boris wave came in on work visas, which knocks out that argument in one fell swoop. People say, oh, we needed the Boris wave of immigration for doctors. Well, 36,000 of the 4 million people who arrived under the Boris wave were doctors. That's less than 1%. So I'm sorry, those arguments are just null and void at the outset. In terms of our assumptions, so we extensively cite our sources. To the degree that there is government data with regards to historic cohorts of migration, we have used those. And so, with the greatest of respect to anecdotes that you might have from speaking to people, the reality is the care sector, in terms of the Boris wave care workers who are brought in, are going to be an enormous fiscal drag for the country, fiscal catastrophe actually, in no small part because far more dependents came in on those care workers than actual people that work in care homes. And that's not even their fault. That's just the insane immigration policy that was brought to bear by the Tories. All the more reason to have such an inquiry. So we've laid out what our sources are. I want to say one other thing too, specifically about the care sector, because it's been really interesting hearing the government, particularly left-wing think tanks and certain government sources tie themselves in knots about this. So if you look at the care sector, people say, well, British people just won't do those jobs. Now, to the degree British people don't do those jobs, the Centre for Social Justice recently published a really good paper showing that if you are a British household or a household eligible for welfare with recourse to public funds, you can make pretty much as much money, in fact more money in many cases, if you ticked all of the welfare boxes in your household, than if there were 2 people working on minimum wage, right? Which is already an abomination. Once the care sector, once these hundreds of thousands, actually millions of foreign national care workers get access to public funds and recourse, now that is unprecedented, right? So I can't prove this based on historical data. Anyone who understands human incentives, what do you think they're going to do? The likelihood is that they are going to move out of those jobs. And there are certain MPs even who I've seen on the record say, well, what's going to happen is they're going to move out of those care jobs. And so begins the Ponzi scheme, right? They move on to other jobs and perhaps less back-breaking work, and then we need another Boris wave to bring it in. So that's one really important reason why we published this work, because these forecasting bodies and, frankly, the Treasury, they have been party to perpetrating a Ponzi scheme on the British people. The British people have been told time and again that mass untrammeled immigration is really good for the economy. So why is it there's been no real wage growth for such a long time? Why can't our economy grow? Why do British people feel so much poorer over the last 2 decades and not richer?
And in terms of the fiscal impact of training and paying for British care workers,
yep. There will be a cost for that, for sure, and we're very open about that, and we'll have more to announce about that too. But I want to mention this too, that clearly the care sector needs workers. We've already talked about an acute skills shortage visa, where to the degree we have to have a migrant do that job, a commensurate training place will be created. Yes, at taxpayer cost, fine. But that's the only way we're actually going to end this addiction to foreign labour. So we've been very open about that. But I will tell you, that will be a rounding error on the mountainous costs of endless more mass immigration.
Very good. Very, very good. Kitty Donaldson, the iPaper.
Thank you. Do you think Donald Trump is Jesus Christ? Or do you think this is evidence of cognitive decline?
Those are some options.
That's quite a wide, sort of a broad canvas you've given me. He's 80 in a few weeks' time. I mean, he has a very unusual way of operating. And let's go back 10 years. You know, people were asking that question 10 years ago. There were Democrats screaming 10 years ago that the 25th Amendment should be moved in Congress, and those same voices are saying the same things now. I don't think he's changed very much at all, which some people like and a lot of people don't. David Lynch, Press Association.
Thank you very much. I just wonder if I could ask two things, if I might, please. Firstly, on the election in Hungary overnight, it's been reported in several places there's links between Reform and Viktor Orban's party. What lessons, if any, are you learning from his defeat? And secondly, I'd just like to ask a more broad question. We frequently hear from you at these press conferences about some of the most salient political issues facing voters at the moment: migration, law and order, the economy. One area we very infrequently hear from you on, though, is health. Why is that?
No, it's a very fair point, and you know, we're a work in progress. We are growing our list of men and women that are acting as spokesmen and women, taking on departments. You know, I mean, if you'd sat here 3 months ago, you know, one of the most common questions was, "Well, aren't you just a one-man band? Isn't it just Nigel that speaks on everything?" You know, and there's nobody else. And since then, I've appointed 4 senior people in positions. I've appointed a leader in Wales. I've appointed a leader in Scotland. There is a new head of local government for us, who's a former county council leader and member of parliament. He'll take his role in the next couple of days. So we're getting there. And on health, well, I'm currently in talks with somebody who has headed up an NHS trust and dramatically turned it round in terms of money and delivery. And yes, we are going to, of course, put forward some radical ways of getting better bang for buck for the British people on the National Health Service. And contrary to what Labour will tell you or the Tories will tell you, you know, we're not going to privatise it or charge you, but it's not working well. And the higher percentage of GDP we put into health, the fewer hospital beds we have. So there's a lot of evidence there that it's not working. As for Hungary, what lessons can we learn? Well, if I was in power for 16 years, I'd be same age as Donald Trump, which I think may just be too long. So 16 years is too long for any leader in any democracy. Nobody survives that long, whether it's John Howard on Australia, a Margaret Thatcher, a Tony Blair. Leaders of countries have a term limit, and anything much over 10 years appears to be about what it is. As for his replacement, who of course was a member of Fidesz himself, and you know, the attitude towards Putin will change. He'll be slightly friendlier with the European Union than Orban was, but not very much. And when it comes to protecting Hungarian culture, I don't think this is some massive lurch away to the liberal left of politics at all that some would like to paint out. It's not that massive a change. It's just that one man had been in the... I mean, he served 5 terms. He'd been there since 2010, but he'd done a term as Prime Minister before. So, you know, I think enough was enough. It was time for a different person. Peter Walker, The Guardian.
Hello, I'm looking in the corner. I want to ask a couple of questions about the figures that you come up with. In the past, when you've given previous hundreds of billions of pounds costs for the supposed lifetime net cost of this, pretty much every think tank and expert that deals with this subject, including the government's own think tank on this, has said that that's not right and it doesn't take into account the lifetime contribution, for example, in taxes. Is this £622 billion figure basically a bit like the £350 million for the NHS, something that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny but is a good electioneering figure? And on one specific on that, some of your previous figures on this used the Centre for Policy Studies data that they previously withdrawn. I can't see that in the references, so I don't know if that's now gone out for calculations. And I promise the final one. You've very much not ruled out the idea of potentially targeting people like Priti Patel and Boris Johnson for prosecution if you think that they did something criminally wrong. if you're going to form a government, you're going to have to tempt more than just your supporter base over. Is this kind of nasty party stuff really going to get people over?
We're not targeting anybody.
But you're threatening you might jail your political opponents.
We're trying to find out the truth. Don't the British public deserve the truth about the biggest breach of... Certainly in my lifetime, I think these figures... I think this is the greatest breach of trust between the electors and the elected that has happened in my lifetime. We're not being vindictive, but we need to establish the truth, and I think that's absolutely vital. Figures, think tanks, well, you know what? How many times do think tanks get their predictions right or wrong? The CPS figure was interesting, wasn't it? You did use some of those numbers in round terms, and they sort of walked away from it.
Yeah, because the OBR got on the phone with them, frankly, clearly at the behest of the government, got them to recant some numbers. And actually, I'm not speak for the CPS, but I haven't heard the CPS come out and say anything in our document is incorrect. What we've done is use bottoms-up government data. All the citations and sources are there. If you want to put to us that any of those are incorrect, by all means do it. But the notion you're going to condemn it on the broad strokes of condemning it, of comparing it to something that was on a bus years ago, I think is for the birds.
Yeah, and by the way, it wasn't my bus, it was Boris's. So we're back to Boris, there we are.
No, it wasn't. Now, look, we do use, the CPS document, like ours, does use a lot of bottoms-up data from the Migration Advisory Committee, for example, a government source. So again, if you want to go through and look at those sources and say that we've done something incorrect, by all means, put that to us. I want to say one other thing, though. When we talk about tax contributions, again, one of the things we actually did in this analysis, which nobody else has actually done, is look at what is the reality of people who have these jobs. So let's talk about care again. So even to the degree somebody's working in care, what we found, and this is data that is citable, this is real data, is that there's almost no variance in terms of salaries inside care work. There's actually almost no salary progression for people working in care in year one. People who've been working in care for 10 years earn pretty much the same amount. The evidence of that, astonishingly, is when minimum wage goes up, 60% of the entire care sector, their wages go up, right? Now, this is not in any way a denigration on care work, because my mum has worked in care homes for years, right? I have a huge amount of respect for them. But if we're talking about the fiscal contribution, the notion that you can just draw a line up and to the right, which is what most of these government sources do and when they're forecasting, and these think tanks do, like you could do with, for example, with high-skilled, when we're looking at high-skilled workers, that's exactly what we did. Again, it's for the birds. We've got to be real about the true cost of the Boris wave. That's what we've done.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, you're good.